Now let us see how the intraembryonic mesoderm is differentiated. So here we can see a trilaminar germ disc. This is the ectoderm. Then this is the intraembryonic mesoderm. As the mesoderm is lying within the embryonic disc, it is called intraembryonic mesoderm, and this one is the endoderm. So we can see the three germ layers here: ectoderm, then the mesoderm, intraembryonic mesoderm, and the endoderm. Now we will see how the intraembryonic mesoderm is differentiated. So in the midline we have the notochord, and above the notochord is the neural tube. So in the axis we have the notochord. Now, just adjacent to the notochord on either side, the intraembryonic mesoderm is divided, or it is differentiated to form paraaxial mesoderm. So, this is the paraaxial mesoderm lying on either side of the notochord. Now, lateral to the paraaxial mesoderm, we have the intermediate mesoderm. So, this is the intermediate mesoderm, and most laterally we have the lateral plate mesoderm. So, the lateral plate mesoderm extends up to the periphery of the germ disc, and the lateral plate mesoderm will continue with the extra embryonic mesoderm, and the coelom present in the lateral plate mesoderm is called intraembryonic coelom, and it will continue with the extra embryonic coelom. So we have seen how the intraembryonic mesoderm is differentiated. In the center we have the notochord. So just adjacent to the notochord on either side we have the paraaxial mesoderm. Then in between the paraaxial and the lateral mesoderm we have intermediate mesoderm, and lateral to it we have the lateral plate mesoderm. So these are the three parts of intraembryonic mesoderm. So if we remove the amniogenic membrane and we see the disc from above, this is the appearance. So this is the broad cephalic part of the disc, and this is the caudal part. So in the cephalic part we can see the procaudal plate where only epiblast and hypoblast is present, and in future it will form the buccopharyngeal membrane. And caudally, we can see the cloacal membrane, the primitive streak, and the Hensen's node. So in the midline, we have the notochord. So this is the notochord present in the midline extending from Hensen's node up to the procaudal plate. Now adjacent to it, the intraembryonic mesoderm forms paraaxial mesoderm. So this is the paraaxial mesoderm extending from primitive streak cephalically up to the procaudal plate. So this paraaxial mesoderm will later give rise to somites, and the next is the intermediate mesoderm. So it is in the form of a longitudinal groove, again extending from primitive streak to the procaudal plate. And this intermediate mesoderm will give rise to the kidneys and the sex glands or the gonads. So the upper part is segmented and the lower part is unsegmented. So this is the intermediate mesoderm. And laterally we have the lateral plate mesoderm. In the lateral plate mesoderm there appears a coelom or a cavity. So it is known as intraembryonic coelom, and it divides the lateral plate mesoderm in two parts. So the part of lateral plate mesoderm facing towards the ectoderm is called somatopleuric intraembryonic mesoderm. So this is somatopleuric intraembryonic mesoderm, and the part of lateral mesoderm which is facing towards the endoderm is called splanchnopluric intraembryonic mesoderm. So we will revise again. The three parts of intraembryonic mesoderm are paraaxial mesoderm, intermediate mesoderm, lateral plate mesoderm. Paraxial mesoderm gives rise to somites. Intermediate mesoderm will form the kidneys and the gonads. And the lateral plate mesoderm with the advent of coelom is divided into somatopleuric and splanchnopluric mesoderm. Somatopleuric mesoderm gives rise to parietal layer of serous membrane, mainly the pericardial, then the pleura and the peritoneum. So these three serous membrane have outer parietal and inner visceral layer. So the parietal layer of these three serous membrane is formed by the somatopleuric membrane, and the visceral membrane of the pericardium, pleura and the peritoneum, it is formed by the splanchnopluric intraembryonic mesoderm. And the coelom or the cavity present in the lateral plate mesoderm will give rise to the pericardial cavity, pleural cavity and the peritoneal cavity. So now let us study the paraaxial mesoderm in detail. So this paraaxial mesoderm gives rise to somites. Okay, so here we can see the paraaxial mesoderm. It is giving rise to somites. Now we will divide it in two parts. Okay, the otic vesicle is there. So the pre-otic somites are there and post-otic somites are there. Pre-otic somites are unsegmented. Okay, the pre-otic somites are unsegmented. Most rostral to the otic vesicle, we have the unsegmented mesenchyme which gives rise to base of the skull and striated muscles of the head. Then the pre-otic somites. The pre-otic somites will give rise to extrinsic muscles of the eyeball. Then the occipital myotome, it will give rise to the striated muscles of the tongue. What we have done? We have divided the paraaxial mesoderm into preotic part and postotic part. The preotic part is unsegmented and most rostral part will give rise to the base of the skull and striated muscles of the head. Preotic vesicle, the preotic somite will give rise to extrinsic muscles of the eye, and the occipital myotome will give rise to the muscles of tongue. Now the post-otic somites, they are segmented. Transverse clefts appear in the mesenchyme and they divide the somites into cubical blocks known as somatomeres, or they are known as metameres. So in all there are 44 pairs of somatomeres or post-otic somites. So these somites, the 44 pairs of somites are divided into 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 8 to 10 coccygeal somites. And these somites will appear at 4th week of intrauterine life. So we can divide the embryonic period in 3 phases. So pre-somite period is between 15 to 20 days. Then the somite period, when these somatomeres will appear, is between 20 to 30 days. So between 20 to 30 days is the somite period, and beyond 30 days it is called post-somite period. Okay, so these are the post-otic somites which are in the form of cubical blocks. So if we see each somite here, now see, this is the notochord, this is neural tube, and this is the paraaxial mesoderm which has given rise to the somite. So initially we have a cavity in the block, and this cavity is known as myocele. Later on this cavity will obliterate by proliferation of the cells from adjacent walls. And now the somite is divided in two parts. Okay, the ventromedial part and dorsolateral part. Okay, so the somite is divided into dorsolateral part and ventromedial part. The ventromedial part of the somite is known as sclerotome and the dorsolateral part is known as dermomyotome. This dermomyotome is divided again into lateral part called dermatome and medial part is called myotome. Okay, so how the somite is divided? It is divided into ventromedial sclerotome and dorsolateral dermomyotome. So laterally we have dermatome and medially we have the myotome. Now the sclerotome, the cells of the sclerotome will lose their epithelial characters, they will become polymorphous and they will start migrating around the notochord. So they will start migrating around the notochord and they will form the primitive or blastemal vertebrae. Okay, so the sclerotome will give rise to the vertebral column or the spine and the ribs, and the occipital somites will give rise to the base of the skull and calvaria. So what are the derivatives of sclerotome? Sclerotome will give rise to vertebral column, ribs. The occipital somites of the sclerotome will give rise to base of the skull and the calvaria of the skull. Now coming to the dermatome. So dermatome is lying lateral, dorsolaterally. Okay. So this dermatome is just beneath the surface ectoderm. We know that the surface ectoderm gives rise to epidermis. Now this dermatome is lying beneath the epidermis. So this will give rise to dermis and subcutaneous part. Okay, so the dermis and subcutaneous tissue develops from dermatome. Now medial to it there is myotome. So this myotome will give rise to all the striated muscles of tongue, trunk, diaphragm and limbs. So let us revise the fate of paraaxial mesoderm in short again. So the paraaxial mesoderm will give rise to somites. We have divided the somites into pre-otic part and post-otic part. The pre-otic part in the rostral part will give rise to the striated muscles of the head. The pre-otic vesicle, the pre-otic somites will give rise to extrinsic muscles of the eye. Occipital myotome will give rise to the musculature of tongue. Now the post-otic part is segmented. Okay, pre-otic is unsegmented and post-otic is segmented. So if we see the segmented part or the cubical block, it is divided into ventromedial sclerotome and dorsolateral dermomyotome. So the sclerotome gives rise to the vertebral column, ribs, base of the skull and calvaria. The dermatome gives rise to dermis and subcutaneous tissue, and the myotome gives rise to all the striated muscles of the trunk, tongue, diaphragm and limbs. So here we can see the somites develop from paraxial mesoderm. Ventromedially sclerotome is there. It will migrate around the notochord and it will form the vertebral column. Then the dermatome, it is lying just beneath the ectoderm. So the dermatome, it will form the dermis and also it will form the subcutaneous tissue. And the myotome will divide into epimere, which is supplied by dorsal ramus, and hypomere is supplied by ventral ramus. Now again here one point should be noted. The mesodermal somite is supplied by the nerve of corresponding spinal segment, and once the muscle is innervated, it does not lose its nerve supply. Some muscles may remain attached to the vertebrae and some muscles may migrate somewhere else, but the nerve supply remains intact. Now what does it mean? We'll see it with an example of diaphragm. Now diaphragm develops from septum transversum. If we remember the embryonic disc, most cranially we have the septum transversum from which the diaphragm is developing. But when the embryonic folds occur, the head fold will shift the diaphragm caudally. Okay, it will lie now in between the thoracic cavity and abdominal cavity. But initially it was present rostrally. So it was supplied by the spinal nerves coming from the cervical plexus. What is the nerve supply of diaphragm? It is C3, C4, C5, phrenic nerve. It is branch of cervical plexus. What does it mean? Once the diaphragm has received or it is been innervated by corresponding spinal segment, now, though it is migrated caudally, but the nerve supply remains intact. Okay. Now, we will just revise the three parts of the intermediate mesoderm. So we can see there is notochord. This is the notochord. Then this one is the neural tube. Okay. So this is the para-axial mesoderm which gives rise to somites. So para-axial mesoderm, the pre-otic part is unsegmented and post-otic part is segmented. Then this one is the intermediate mesoderm. Intermediate mesoderm is in the form of longitudinal groove. Again, its rostral part is segmented, whereas the caudal part is unsegmented. So the unsegmented caudal part will give rise to nephrogenic cord. What are the derivatives of intermediate mesoderm? It gives rise to the kidney and sex glands, that is gonads. Then coming to the lateral plate mesoderm. So the lateral plate mesoderm with the advent of intraembryonic coelom is divided into two parts. Facing towards the endoderm is the splanchnopluric mesoderm, and facing towards the ectoderm is somatopluric mesoderm. Somatopluric mesoderm gives rise to parietal layer of the pleura, pericardium and peritoneum, and the splanchnopluric mesoderm will give rise to the visceral layer of pericardium, pleura and the peritoneum. And this intraembryonic coelom, it will give rise to the pericardial cavity, pleural cavity and peritoneal cavity. So far we have seen the derivatives of para-axial mesoderm, the derivatives of somites. Now we will see the second part of the intraembryonic mesoderm, that is intermediate mesoderm. It is lying in between para-axial mesoderm and lateral plate mesoderm. So the intermediate mesoderm is in the form of longitudinal groove which extends the from the primitive streak up to the procaudal plate, and it is segmented rostrally and unsegmented caudally, and it will give rise to kidneys, ureters and sex glands, mainly the male genital tract. Then coming to the lateral plate mesoderm, so an intraembryonic coelom appears in the lateral plate mesoderm, and this coelom gives rise to body cavities, mainly the pericardial sac, pleural cavity and peritoneal cavity. And with the advent of this cavity, the lateral plate mesoderm is divided in two parts. So facing towards the endoderm is known as splanchnopluric mesoderm. So this is the splanchnopluric mesoderm. It will give rise to the visceral layer of the pericardium, pleura and peritoneum. Apart from this, it will also give rise to the musculature and connective tissue of gut, respiratory tube and heart. Okay, so the musculature of the gut, respiratory tube and the heart is also derived from splanchnopluric mesoderm. Now the mesoderm which is facing towards the ectoderm is called somatopluric mesoderm. So this somatopluric mesoderm will give rise to the parietal layer of serous membrane. So the parietal layer of pericardium, pleura and peritoneum, it develops from the somatopluric mesoderm. Now apart from this, it will also give rise to the skeletal elements of the limb buds, including pectoral girdle and pelvic girdle and the dermis and subcutaneous tissue. So what are the derivatives of somatopluric mesoderm? It gives rise to the parietal layer of serous membrane, and it will also give rise to the dermis, subcutaneous tissue, skeletal elements of the limb buds, including the pectoral girdle and pelvic girdle. Derivatives of intraembryonic mesoderm are all the connective and sclerous tissue. So the supportive framework of our body is formed mainly by the mesoderm. So all the connective tissue and sclerous tissue develops from mesoderm. Then the teeth, except enamel, develops from mesoderm. All the muscles of the body except iris, muscles of iris, that is dilator pupillae and sphincter pupillae, and erector pylorium of the skin. Then the cardiovascular system, lymphatic system, the cortex of adrenal gland, gonads, mesothelial lining of serous membrane, that is pericardium, pleura and peritoneum. They are mesodermal in origin. Then the urogenital system, except most of the part of urinary bladder, prostate and urethra. So these are the derivatives of intraembryonic mesoderm. So before folding of the embryo, the appearance of trilaminar germ disc is like this. So if we go from cephalic part to the caudal part, most cephalic part, we get septum transversum. Then there is pericardial sac. Then we have the precaudal plate which forms the buccopharyngeal membrane. The buccopharyngeal membrane ruptures at fourth week, and the stomatodium or the primitive oral cavity gains communication with primitive gut. Then in the midline we have the neural tube. The cephalic part of the neural tube forms three dilatations for the brain vesicle. So the brain develops from cephalic part of the neural tube, and the distal or the caudal part of the neural tube will give rise to spinal cord. Beneath the neural tube, we have the notochord. Then this is the Hensen's node or the primitive node. There is blastopore or primitive pit in it. Then the primitive streak. Then we have the cloacal membrane which ruptures by seventh week, and most caudally we have connecting stalk which will form the umbilical cord, and within it lies the allantoic diverticulum. We can also see the differentiation of ectoderm, mesoderm here. So the ectoderm, it differentiates into surface ectoderm and neuroectoderm. Intraembryonic mesoderm divides into three parts. So the para-axial mesoderm gives rise to the somites. Then the intermediate mesoderm gives rise to kidneys and the sex glands. And this is the lateral plate mesoderm which continues with extraembryonic mesoderm. So this is the appearance of trilaminar germ disc in the embryonic period before folding of embryo.